Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak today about what is an enormous missed opportunity, a missed opportunity to get Australia on track when it comes to taking real action on climate change, a missed opportunity when it comes to addressing the great inequity and unfairness that exists in this country, the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. Before I talk about that missed opportunity, let's talk a little about the context here and the history behind this legislation. In the government's first budget, we saw a budget that attacked almost every group in Australian society: the young, the old, the sick, the poor. It was a budget that attacked the social contract that many generations have fought so hard to create here in Australia. The notion of a fair go, the notion of what it means to be a caring, decent and compassionate society. And among that budget was a budget measure that was to increase the price of fuel for ordinary Australians, alongside a co-payment to go and see a doctor, alongside changes that mean that young students would find it harder to get a university education. A change that was alongside an indexation measure to pensions, which would have effectively mean a pay cut for almost every pensioner in the country. An indexation or another change that meant that a young person who found themselves unable to find a job was going to be booted off income support for 6 months and struggle to feed, clothe and house themselves. And it was also in the context of a big, bold promise that the Prime Minister made to the nation that there would be no new taxes. That is the context in which this announcement was made, and that is the context in which the Australian Greens responded under the leadership of Senator Christine Milne and supported by each and every member of our party room, and that is that you need to go back to the drawing board, you need to fix that cruel and harsh budget, and if you are to introduce a change to fuel indexation, then you need to do it in a way that transforms our economy and starts taking the necessary action we need to take to address climate change. Instead, what we got from the Prime Minister was the middle finger salute, saying no, every cent going to roads, like it or lump it, and if you don't support us, then what we're going to do is come up with a sneaky plan to hand back every cent to big oil companies. And I say to the opposition, it is the government that would be making a decision to hand back that money to big oil companies, and it would be the government that would wear the consequences of that decision. If you are to introduce a measure, and in principle we do not oppose measures such as increases to fuel through changes to indexation, in principle, but you need to do it in a way that allows us to drive the transformation that's necessary to tackle climate change and also address the regressive impacts of those taxes. And I point to the shining example of how you introduce a pollution tax and drive that transformation in the example that is the introduction of the price on carbon. What we saw there was a price on carbon, essentially a pollution tax. We saw that, but what we also saw was one of the biggest changes to taxation in this country with this enormous raising of the tax-free threshold, which meant that the poorest and most vulnerable people in the Australian community would pay less tax and would be compensated for that decision. And we also saw another $10 billion investment through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to enable us to drive the transformation that's necessary. That is the model for how you introduce a measure such as a pollution tax. And Senator Milne made it absolutely clear at the time that we were prepared to negotiate on the basis of that model, which is let us invest in public transport to drive that transformation and let's deal with some of those equity measures. But what we saw was a government that attempted to bully and hector and use a sneaky mechanism by using blackmail, effectively suggesting that money would go back to big oil companies, and that's where we were up until recently. But there was a change recently. The government has finally recognised that it can't use a sledgehammer if it wants to get its legislation through the Australian Parliament, because this is the Parliament voted by the people, and this Parliament exists as a check on that untrammelled power of the executive. And so it's true that we started having, that is, the Australian Greens, started having some discussions with the government on both of those measures that were outlined earlier under the leadership of Christine. And that is, let's see an investment in public transport and let's start dealing with those equity measures. And we were making progress. Those talks were constructive and we were making progress. Now, this nonsense that you can't pick one public transport project over another is just that. It's nonsense. Why can't we have a public transport fund that allows us to pay for those measures that we know will help us drive the change that's necessary? Why can't we have an equity measure in the budget that allows a small compensation payment for some of the most vulnerable members in this community who will be hit by this? And despite what Joe Hockey might say, poor people do drive cars. They drive them, and this is a bigger hit. This is a bigger hit on their budget than it is on those people who are at the more wealthy end of the income scale. But what we saw only yesterday was a case of putting politics before good policy. That's what it was, pure and simple. Putting politics before good policy. This veil of an excuse that we can't hand the money back to big oil companies. Give me a break. Give me a break. Up until yesterday, we heard comments from the Prime Minister about, or the opposition leader about this being a huge mistake, being an attack on poor people, the government using blackmail to try and get their way. And then we have this road to Damascus conversion, conveniently after the Labor Party was shown up to be hypocrites for their decision to oppose pension changes that would benefit those with more modest means ahead of those at the wealthy end of the scale. And it was pure politics. Simply the idea that the Greens will get an outcome that was good for the Australian community was too much to bear. Too much to bear. So what do we see? We see the opposition leader and the government do a deal that puts more money into roads, that does nothing to address climate change and the transformation that's necessary in this country, and does nothing to address the inequity that exists in this measure. In fact, the opposition leader went as far as to say, the more you drive, the more you pay, the more roads you can have. Every person in the country who cares about climate change, global warming, the future that our children will inherit, will remember those words. Get in your car, put the pedal to the metal, pollute the atmosphere, and we'll build more roads. What does that do in addressing what is the great challenge that lies ahead of us? It does nothing. And this is a case of politics being put ahead of policy. We had an outcome that would have meant hundreds of millions of dollars invested in public transport, some compensation for people on low incomes, ripped away from the Australian community because we saw a Labor Party desperate to do a deal with the government to deny the Greens the opportunity to get that outcome for the Australian community. That's what this was about. Nothing else. Nothing else. Politics ahead of policy. We could have worked together on this. We could have had a sensible discussion about what was necessary to get this measure over the line to ensure that we see the changes that will set this country up into this century. Instead, again, no vision, no forward thinking. How do we ensure that we deny some oxygen to an opponent and ensure that they don't make the evening news that night. That is what is wrong with the political debate in this country, is that for too long politics has been put ahead of good policy, and what we need now is we need people to recognise that we are here at the service of the Australian people and that our job is to deliver outcomes for them, not outcomes for us. And that is why the Greens express our deepest concerns at a measure that will make pollution worse, that will ensure that people at the lower income end are hit hardest, and that we do nothing to address the great challenges that lie ahead of us, and that is the challenge in addressing catastrophic climate change. If you ever wanted a clearer indication of where this government and the opposition stand on the great challenge that lies ahead of us, look no further than this decision.